Hello, everyone. It is 4:20. Welcome to Auda's BTH. My virtual town halls are designed for us to foster conversation, thought provoking, share some ideas, and also learn from experts in different fields about subjects that matters to all of us. I'm really excited to be hosting today Armando Gudiño, but I want to just preempt that we talked about hosting a 420 conversation. He is the California director for the Drug Policy Alliance. And at first, we talked about, what is this 420 term comes from and what does it really mean? But today, we just heard about George Floyd and the news about his verdict. For a lot of us, this seems like a big win. For some of us, feels like just the beginning of seeing some justice from criminal justice reform standpoint. So Armando has plenty of experience with this subject as he worked in legalizing or decriminalizing cannabis. And he is right now, I believe, in downtown Los Angeles, where a lot of people are gathering for the George Floyd, verdict and the results of the judge releasing information about Derek Chauvin. So, Armando, welcome.
Thank you, Aura, very much for bringing me back. And just one minor correction, just so that, I'm the policy manager, not the director. I don't want my boss to say, wait a minute, why did you take my title?
I thought of that, but I thought that she was more than a director for some reason. But,
She's a
okay, we
state
have
director.
that
Yes.
clear. We have that clear.
I'm actually here in downtown and Grand Park, just overlooking City Hall. And behind me, there's a small group of activists and advocates and community stakeholders that came together. Will be hosting a press conference pretty soon. And while I do a lot of work in drug policy, and that is my primary field, as you know, Auda, one of my personal and probably longest standing passion, now more than 20 years, has always been as a photographer.
Mm-hmm.
So I do regularly run out there with a camera in hand and point it in people's faces and take pictures. So that's a little bit of what I'm doing today.
Well, we're so happy to have you here to talk about 420 or, cannabis or this celebration. I posted the question a couple of days ago, and some folks in my social media community mentioned a lot of different things about 420. And I like to bring this conversation because, I'm as a Latina, as a Colombiana, I firsthand saw the results of the war on drugs in my own country, in Colombia. Much of the reason why my family and I moved to the United States was because of the legacy that the war, not even the legacy, like what we have to endure living in a foreign country like Colombia and drug policy, foreign drug policy. So that's number one. That's why I usually like to, if you guys like to smoke and eat all the amazing edibles out there and support the brands, good for you. I just think that is important for us to remember why actually some people can get to enjoy that and not end up in jail. Like the thousands of people that end up in jail because of smoking a joint on the street or because they were at a party and got caught by the police, and also shows the systemic issue that we have in terms of race and who gets to end up, who goes to jail when you get caught with drugs. So you have plenty of experience about this issue. What do you know about the celebration of 420?
Well, the one of the prevailing narratives around 420, the actual date itself and where the idea came from, seems to be rooted in this um, experience of a couple of teenagers actually that date back to, I believe it was the San Rafael area, who story goes that they came into contact with a local soldier who gave them a map of an area where he himself was growing weed.
Okay.
And these teenagers, smokers themselves, had this little code amongst them to meet after school at 420 to smoke a joint and drive out to the hills to look for this, this little grow operation that this soldier, I believe he was a sailor, had going. And story goes that they actually never found it, but popular culture eventually picked up, and it grew and it grew and it grew. And in that regard, this is where I think the conversation becomes interesting, because while there's a lot to be said about the the party vibe that comes with 420, right?
Mm-hmm.
um I think it's a perfect example of how something like cannabis became popularized, so much so that once it hit the mainstream, it was almost accepted, all the while still remained one of those exclusive social constructs that, as you pointed out, for some, it almost becomes an indicator of, social culture, subculture, party lifestyle associated with those that are non-threatening, i.e., non-people of color, versus those that go to jail for the same activity.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see traces of this dating back, geez, more than 100 years. When we first saw this, and the demonization and criminalization of people of color, particularly Asians, in the mid late 1800s, where they were characterized as drug users, criminals, people that were tantalizing white women. And it was around that time, Aura, that I think it's very important to note that you had the emergence of this important divide of narrative. It is
Mm-hmm.
around that time that we started to hear the beginning of what were drug users and what were medicine users, when in fact at the same time it was really much the same thing, right? If we look back to the to the medicine drug divide that we saw in the late 1800s, if you were white, you were medicating yourself, you were addressing, problems that came with having received a diagnosis because you had access to healthcare. But if you were Asian, Latino, or Black, well, no, you were just a drug user who were doing so,
Yeah.
who were using drugs for recreational purposes. So
And
that
you were a
became an
criminal.
important,
Yeah.
right, right.
And you
That
were labeled
became,
a criminal.
so it is that narrative that I think to this day you still see. And in fact, it's important noting that even in what happened today with the conviction of the murderer, Chauvin, you know, during the course of his trial, that narrative came back up, right? They tried to criminalize, demonize, and essentially convict, all the while justify his murder because of his drug use or his
Mm-hmm.
alleged drug use. And so we still see this long-standing history, which is why it's very important that we note that while this was a conviction, by no stretch of the imagination should we consider this a a form of justice,
Absolutely.
because justice, true justice, means that George Floyd, would still be alive. First of all,
Absolutely.
I think.
Absolutely.
Second of all, in the process of this case, he would not have been criminalized the way they attempted to criminalize him for what was his drug use and previous drug use, among other things. And then lastly, I think what we do and can say is that what we saw today was what I would call, what I said to my own kids when we talked about it, um, a morsel, a small morsel of accountability, right? A morsel of accountability in which an individual who did wrong, who did wrong under a particular government structure that gave him power, i.e., as a police officer, was actually convicted for his wrongdoing.
Mm.
Because, and that's important because at no point during the course of this trial, and if you look at the transcripts and all the coverage that was done of this case, race actually didn't come into play. So the systemic racism and the institutional bias has not yet been addressed. So while we did have some accountability and we now have a convicted murderer, rightfully so, I think we still have a very, very long way to go.
Absolutely. And I just want to add that it took millions of people around the world to protest, to demand. It took all of us to see that video running around the internet over and over for us to finally see a little bit of accountability.
Right.
So if, I mean, and this is the first in how many
And
decades?
not only how many, I mean, one important thing that we got to remember is that unfortunately, these type of incidents in which an officer abuses the authority he's granted is not. I mean, look what happened to this young brother Adam Toledo. I mean, it's just, it's now being disclosed that he too was, violently murdered at the hands of police.
Yeah.
A
I mean,
13-year-old Chicano boy. And the
Breonna
point is,
Taylor, so many people. I mean, I will spend maybe an hour naming, and even the people that we don't know pre-social media, where these things used to happen and there were no body cameras, there were no witnesses,
there you go.
we were really scared. There was no Sean King, there was no BLM, there was so much injustice towards people because of the way that they look, their color, where they live, also your zip code. And again, a lot of these, where you end up living, the earth, that the air that you end up breathing, the fact that you might get more targeted by the police or not is defined so much by the color of your skin and your zip code.
You make an excellent point, because these things have been happening. These type of assaults and murders have been going on for decades. I think the fact that we're now broadcasting them, now we have access to the videos, for many, it seems as if there's a rise in these incidents, when in fact, maybe not. All there is that it's now being broadcast and it's now being recorded. We now have access to this. So it comes almost as a shock to a lot of people that this is happening, when in fact, we should be reminding one another that this is a continuation of policies that, again, many of which are rooted in this disastrous war on drugs that uses drugs as a tool of criminalization, in the case of George Floyd and so many others, even after death, to try and justify their conduct and the way they treat people.
And I'm so glad that you're bringing this back to the war on drugs again. This is something that is so close to my heart, because in a lot of ways, my family and I left Colombia because of, the war on drugs and foreign policy and practices in the United States like entrapment, which is happening right now. The idea that they send young people to bring more people to jail. I mean, there are so many laws and rules right now that are not really about justice or about safety. They're really about perpetuating a system that is making money out of people being in jail. We see that from immigrants being treated as criminals because they're coming here seeking asylum. And, that represents money. Back 10 years ago, when I used to work more on immigrant rights issues, we found out that it pays about $150 for an undocumented person to be in a jail cell or in jail. So that is a lot for a lot of private jails, which is many of them around the country. It's very profitable for them to have immigrants to get, processed.
Very,
Even
very,
if
very profitable.
they didn't commit a law, they didn't break the law. But I want to encourage people that are listening to ask questions. I see some questions already on the chat, and questions for Armando. I want to return to what's happening now, and I appreciate you bringing us up to speed with the history of how Mexicans, Asian Americans were targeted with this rhetoric that they were marihuanos. Remember this term? And for us Latinos, Latinx, like I said, I host these conversations because even in our culture, it's still unusual to talk about cannabis.
Right.
And a lot of people of color communities, it's unusual to talk about cannabis openly or to even say, I like it. It helps my headaches, or it helps with my, feel better, or it helps me sleep, or just plain, like, I just like it, So I like to bring these conversations coming from a person of color and a woman of color, because it's important for us to know that it's not just about the recreational part of cannabis, that it had such a huge more implication. So we wanted to talk about the social political implications of 420. So where are we with decriminalizing, legalizing cannabis, at least in California and around the country? I think we're a little ahead of the game, or we want to believe we're a little more ahead of the game in California. I mean, Colorado did it first.
Yeah, no. So yes, I mean, we are, in many regards. Look, California has long played a history, an important role in advancing some of these policies. It was in California where we first saw the first legal jurisdiction develop a legal framework back then in 1996 for medical marijuana. And to be frank with you, at that point the juggernaut let loose, and there was no stopping it then, right? And when you fast forward 20 years, as we saw the development of cannabis policy in places like Colorado and Oregon, California to follow soon. At this point, we've hit critical mass, right?
Mhm.
We've begun to see progress and advances being made even at the federal level. Just this past December, we were able to see the passage of a bill in the House that, while it's unlikely to proceed in the Senate, it's important to note that this is still progress, right?
Yeah.
At this point, even just earlier this year, a couple of other states have legalized, much to the way in which places like California. California is now a full legal state, right? You can buy recreational cannabis in a sanctioned store with a license permitted by both the state and or the city in which it is located. It's had its challenges, without a doubt. It's had some serious challenges that, none of us at the time when we were working on these policies, look, none of us had a crystal ball. And as much as we would like to say that we were going to anticipate some of these challenges, no, we didn't. And, that included just how many cities would actually come on board and support the statewide legalization framework. We
Mhm.
quickly found out within the first couple of years that as many as 70% at one point, and right now we're somewhere between 60 and 70% of the jurisdictions in the state of California remain as what's considered dry counties. So they're still not selling recreational marijuana. And that created some
Really?
challenges.
So
Absolutely.
even though in California cannabis is legal, there is still some places that they're not fully on board, or they're not considered cannabis legal.
By last account, a little bit more than 50% of the state, actually.
Wow,
So
I
you can
didn't see
still,
that coming.
yeah, no, not a lot of us did it. And a lot of that had to do, there was a couple of several indicators. I mean, on the one hand, remember that as we ushered in the new era of legalization in California, we so too ushered in an incompetent bigot in the White House and there was a degree of uncertainty what was going to happen, between that crucial relationship between state and federal, especially and particularly around, you know, legalization. Right at the federal level, marijuana continues to be, a Schedule One drug that can be prosecuted.
Wow.
Is the federal government coming into states prosecuting, particularly low-level sales, recreational weed shops, and things like that? Well, no, we really haven't seen that. There have been some instances where the federal government has come in after large-scale operators who they deemed in violation of federal law, including some that were legal operators, fully licensed. But generally, to go after the mom and pop retailer, that hasn't happened. It's not happening. It's way too expensive for the federal government to waste their resources on that. So at this point, we continue to work towards developing and fully implementing um, a, a legal framework at the local level. What we did is we were able to construct a framework for regulation at a state level as a state policy shop. And when we passed Proposition 64, it's akin to developing a template for how legal marijuana can and should be sold. What are some of the restrictions, challenges with, advertisement, testing, etc. But it's up to the local jurisdictions, the small cities that you live in, and that ultimately are in charge of implementing how, for example, retail will be sold at the local level, where we fell short. And to this day, we still have many, 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 many cities and other jurisdictions that just said, we don't want to sell weed. Now,
Yeah.
the bigger ones, San Diego, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Oakland, they're all on board. And to be frank with you, they have some of the highest, if not the highest concentration of population. But, you got to remember that cannabis legalization, full embrace of the sale for 21 and older, was passed with a significant margin of support. And today, we know that well over 70% of the population, state and national, are in support of
Yeah.
legalization. So
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So
there's definitely been progress.
that's a good breakdown. I mean, clearly we're not there yet. I mean, there are still a lot of people that were convicted because of cannabis related convictions that are still in jail. And that as we continue finding ways to alleviate that, the country is also kind of doing a change of hearts of sorts also towards decriminalization of cannabis. I have a question here for you that Peter is asking, and he's asking, how was the repeal of alcohol prohibition possible so many years ago, but not cannabis today? So I'm assuming that he's not in California, maybe, that he's asking this.
Well,
Can we talk about the comparison in alcohol and cannabis, and also
well,
prohibition of both at some point?
sure. So look, a couple of things um, that are very fundamental to this question, and I've gotten asked this question, geez, in 20 years of this type of work, many, many, many times, and we have on occasions referenced it ourselves from a policy perspective. But one of the most fundamental differences that has to be stated is that in the case of alcohol, the moral crusaders, as they're often referred to back then, um, they sought to outlaw the sale of a product that was already otherwise readily available and under a significant degree of oversight. You could purchase alcohol, it was otherwise legal,
Mhm.
and made illegal, which only brought it underground. And if anything, provides as an excellent example of what happens when you seek to eliminate a product that is in such great demand, right?
Mhm.
The only thing that happened was crime went up something by 6, 7, 800% in some areas. You know, um, yeah, deaths of overdose from bad liquor that was being produced in people's kitchens and bathrooms. People were dying as a result of that. So um, once that period of moral crusade began to diminish, and in fact, government saw that the demand was way too great to control, and the need for tax revenue from alcohol, considering that at the time we were looking to come out of that first initial Great Depression, which brings up an interesting point relative to cannabis today. Um, it was a matter of effectively bringing back a law or access to a resource or product that had otherwise already been there. In the case of marijuana, marijuana was something that was present in our country, a long-standing history in places like Mexico and Latin America, and let's not even get into it historically. It's been around for thousands of years. But in the case of marijuana, marijuana did not have a legal framework from which it was sold and consumed. It was generally consumed and nobody really cared at the time until it was used to criminalize, particularly Mexicans in the Southwest. They came as a personal vendetta by the then, William Randolph Hearst, who was a well-known bigot and carried a lot of anger and spite towards Mexicans, particularly in the northern part, when during the Mexican Revolution they took a lot of land he was using for paper pulp production. William Randolph Hearst was, of course, one of the first and largest newspaper moguls, certainly at the time. And today, most people know him for the little castle he has up in Central California, where
Mhm.
his bigotry is well cemented in the form of buildings. So it's had a very different trajectory and very different social construct. Cannabis, people use it for entertainment, while marijuana early on, it was specifically used for criminalization and demonization of people. So that right there speaks to how that movement grew and evolved. And, we legalized recreational use for adults almost 100 years later. So
Yeah,
we had 100 years of ideological construct that we need to start to deconstruct. Stigma,
that's a whole
race,
century.
bigotry. I mean, a whole
And
century.
and and Peter also added here in his question that if this was because criminalization of cannabis was a tool for systemic racism, he also mentioned that he's in California.
Yeah, no, no.
So
I mean, listen, no doubt, no doubt, 1,001%. The
100%.
war on the war on drugs, it has been in many regards the most successful policy at the local, state, national, and federal, international level, by which um, a form of American racism has been executed, particularly among people of color. The war on drugs has been one of the most effective tools by which you can criminalize, persecute, detain, and incarcerate individuals on the
And
grounds of
also
nothing more than what they use.
and also how to utilize funds to influence the political process of other countries,
Sure.
and also how to move money from the federal level to state level funding to local level to international trade. And again, I like to come from the perspective that I was one of the people that was affected by the war on drugs, even though like I wasn't never in jail for drugs. But a lot of Colombians that immigrated to the United States and other countries, Europe, other places, was because of the war on drugs. Like the amount of money injected to catch these narcos and give the American people the false idea of safety, that because they were burning, cocaine plantations in the Amazons and in other places, because they were cutting, getting, drug dealers, or, we call, you guys call them narcos, we call them all some other things in Spanish. But getting them to justice, give the American people the full sense of safety. When I'm sorry to tell you guys, but where there's a demand, there's going to be a supply. And the United States is one of the biggest countries that consumes drugs in general,
Well,
cocaine,
not one of
cannabis.
the. It is the biggest. And look, I can give you a figure actually. We know that it's just north of 50 billion annually
There you go.
that's used towards the war on drugs. Half of which comes from state and local agencies. The other half comes from the federal government. And through those funds, the only thing we've achieved is to become still the number one consumer nation in the world, the number one nation to incarcerate the most people in the world,
Yeah,
and in fact, the number one nation to systemically create a racist system that by design seeks to over police communities of color and incarcerate communities of color, particularly men of color, and at its core, Black and Latino men. So it's a
absolutely.
long-standing history.
Absolutely. And look, we got El Chapo and they have made plenty of movies about him and everything else. And has the violence in the border gone any better?
No, it's gotten worse, in fact.
It's not worse.
In fact, the policy idea, the strategy employed by the American government was one that was employed during the 80s and 90s, and particularly parts of the Caribbean and South America. This
Yeah,
notion, this concept that you chop the head and it creates destabilization of the cartels that then make it more manageable. And while actually there was some degree of success in that, in places like South America that were producer nations, places like Mexico and Central America that were transit ports, when they employed that strategy, it actually had the opposite effect. In the case of Mexico, we had the creation of what a phenomenon now known as los cartelitos. So
yeah.
one cartel, you chop the head off, and it turns into 5, 6, 10 different cartels fighting for the same territory, and therefore more violence. So it goes to show that the war on drugs strategy in one place doesn't necessarily work in another, and yet consumerism continues to grow, and there's less attention paid towards providing adequate harm reduction mental health care services. And I'll summarize it with this: people who have a problem with the consumption and overconsumption of any substance, particularly illicit substance, what they need is medical support. They need medical attention, not incarceration. And this is
Absolutely.
where the
Bravo.
drug war is fundamentally flawed. It is a
Yeah.
policy that has failed by every measurement and every metric. And as long as we continue with that, we're going to continue to see the devastation it's caused time and again.
I'm so glad you're bringing this conversation there because it's so important for us to also make the clear connection about our unhoused community and mental illness and how over policing. So all the funding, right? We talk about defunding the police, but a lot of the funding to the police goes for them to do a job that they are not designed to do. For them to
Excuse me.
act like social workers, for them to act like doctors, psychiatrists, therapists, where they don't do that. I mean, I have not met or heard of the first police force where they are also trained and all have the skill set to really deploy tactics that can really be helpful to a community like homelessness or drug addiction or such. So it's so important. And I know last year, it feels like it's been 100 years, but it's only been last a couple of months that we talked about a harm reduction. And the idea that we need to understand that people that abuse drugs have an illness, have a mental illness, have a physical illness, are going through trauma, are going through difficult times, and it's for us to bring support services and not criminalize them. And it brings me back to my first point, which is, but criminalizing is making money for some people.
Of course.
Treating people and helping them get out of their situation, it doesn't make money to a certain industry.
Right. No, and listen, let's call it for what it is. When we look at the exaggerated, inflated budgets of some in law enforcement, when we look at the private prison industries, when we look at, you know, the cost associated with persecuting, prosecuting, incarcerating, and housing individuals primarily for petty drug crimes, it is a billion-dollar industry.
Yeah.
Billion-dollar industry. And the direct and collateral consequences of that, and the separation of families, in many cases, removing the primary earner. Oftentimes, many of these are done for petty drug crimes, for which people will sit in a jail cell waiting to even see a judge, and the consequences that come with a conviction of something like that are just devastating long term. It in effect renders individuals to a degree incapable of continuing to be positive, productive members of society for something they chose to consume of their own accord with no direct harm to others. And yet, you see, going back to what we started on the conversation, right? This is the case for a lot of people of color. But when you see on the opposite side, well, no, it's just a bunch of party goers, 420 celebration, let's go party. And there's a lot, if not a very little, impact done on this because it's perceived to be something recreational. Where on the other hand, for people of color, it's oftentimes pushed out there as drug abuse that leads to other, crimes. So the bias is continues to live, and full circle, bringing it back to the issue of George Floyd, I think, which is why it's more important today more than ever before that we not see what happened today as a victory or as a form of justice, but rather a small, tiny step towards accountability. In this case, holding one single individual accountable for his actions, rightfully so, and that we start and continue to push to ensure that system-wide there is a degree of reform that diminishes how we use drugs to systemically target individuals and persecute.
Yeah, and unless we really tackle white supremacy, patriarchy, um, and systemic racism in how our economic system fuels all of these other systems, we're going to have this conversation every year. And maybe we're going to see more cops being prosecuted by killing innocent people. Because let's remember, I mean, I have this discussion a lot online where people are like, but he was running, but he was trying not to be there, or he was wrestling with the cops. I'm like, running away is not it doesn't give the cops a reason to kill you, or even fighting back. I mean, after the latest, I mean, it feels like every day there is a new story and a new video. I saw a compilation of videos about how white people are treated when they're stopped by the police. Even people with guns, even people with openly guns in their hands, white people with openly hands, and how the police responds to them. So there's got to be something that us and individuals need to do better. And I invite parents, teachers, mothers, everyone right now to really think about your own bias, and not just bias towards, I mean, how do we even behave towards Black people ourselves? What, and I see it in places where you see maybe an African-American individual arriving and everybody starts grabbing their purse and they get very nervous. And I'm like, wow, this is really something that we're so unaware of that we do as a society, that we don't even understand the implications, So I invite everyone that is watching to really dig deeper and understand your biases, because systemic racism and patriarchy and white supremacy is something that is a root cause disease that is really causing all these other things.
And you see the roots of this. A lot of this is rooted in this drug war. We created a degree of social acceptance that if a person looks a certain way, if a person acts a certain way, if a person is different and represents the otherness that you are not, it's almost as if by default, therefore, it's negative. And we saw this. We saw this during. A perfect example is what we saw during the Opium Wars in China during the 1800s, 1865, 1875, when the British and the Americans sought to protect their drug sellers, their drug traffickers. When the Chinese government said, "Look, we're going to stop the drug trade of opium into our country because it is creating problems for our people," the British and the Americans went to war for this and
Mhm.
literally said, "You are not going to stop our drug sellers, our drug traffickers, for bringing in drugs into your country." And
Mhm.
they invaded China for that reason. And while that might seem like, well, that's a long time ago, but see, it is there where the narrative, particularly as it relates to the criminalization of the Chinese, began to surface that we later saw here, and the first anti drug consumption law that was passed against a particular group of color, community of color, were against Chinese men in the latter part of the 1800s, followed by persecution of black men in the South in the early 1900s, and then subsequently Latino men, Mexican men in particular, in California and the Southwest under cannabis. So when you see the traditional trajectory of drug laws, opium, cocaine, and marijuana, which, by the way, were all substances that were readily available. You could purchase them on the counter, with the exception of marijuana, which grew pretty much anywhere. But
At
you could
some
purchase.
point, yeah,
You
they were
you
all
could
legal.
purchase. You could purchase a vial of cocaine, a vial of heroin, at the local drugstore for 11 cents.
Yeah, no,
That was, you could go and say, "Hey, give me this," and you had a bunch of kids and adults. With the kids, because it was very common to give kids, cocaine liquid
yes,
on their teeth when they were they're gumming.
yeah,
Their teeth were growing, so you had a bunch of kids pretty much doped out on cocaine, and that was okay.
yeah,
But that was medicinal. That was the medicine drug divide that I talked about earlier. At that time, it was okay because they were using it, and while there was people developing problems with it, the minute that others sought to use it for recreational purposes, although whites use it as much, then it was like, well, no, that's not medicine, no longer medicine. That's actually drugs. You're a criminal.
another problem.
And and to this day, we still see that. When we see
Yeah,
somebody with mental illness, we are quick to say, well, he's on drugs. No, a person might have mental illness. Doesn't mean they're on drugs. Are they self-medicating in the case of many? Sure, sure,
thank
sure.
you.
In the absence of a public health approach, people will consume and self-medicate in a variety of ways.
Absolutely. And now that in terms of cannabis, that we see a wave of acceptance. Is legal, is being decriminalized, or is in the process of being decriminalized in California, in our communities. What are some of the quality control happening? I think we lost. There you go. What are some of the quality control organizations, or how are we making sure? Because it's just now it's so incredible to see, like, you step on dispensaries that look like Mac stores, that they're ready to sell you a computer. There's all sorts of flavors. There is things, that are, the marketing has also developed so much in the industry. So how do we know that this is really, I mean, I hear so many things also about it, that kind of is now is mass produced, it's kind of like GMO now, that it's actually bad for you, you don't even know what you're smoking, it's terrible. So what are some, what are some of the quality control practices that are happening? If you can maybe educate us a little bit on that sense, who can we trust, basically, if you are a smoker?
Well, look, I mean, it's a great question. I tell folks who have asked similar questions, the best way to ensure that what you're getting is good quality. And by good quality, I'm not necessarily talking about potency levels and so forth, right? that's a whole other issue in and of itself. We're talking about supplies that are not adulterated with other substances, things of that nature. California created a rather complex, somewhat sophisticated system that's commonly referred to seed to sale. It's a system in which, through um, rigorous testing, can actually trace the product itself from the point of seedling, growth, development, picking, production, manufacturing, and sale. Right? It's actually rather complex and pretty detailed, much to the chagrin of a lot of even those in the legal industry who say this is way too much. But it was done with the purpose of ensuring that, you know, that products that are being sold are safe. Because prior to this, when, you know, in the case of marijuana, was when it was being brought over from other countries, what you ended up with was something that was smuggled in. You had no idea where it was coming from, no idea what was mixed in with it. So this was a way in which we would ensure that the product itself would be otherwise safe. So the best way to do that is, if you are looking to consume cannabis within the state of California, make sure that in the city where you're going, that it is a licensed shop. Many locations have opted to identify themselves as a licensed provider. Some cities have opted to provide some sort of a emblem or some sort of a tag that says, you know, licensed by,
Right.
and then you'll know that the product being provided there is otherwise safe and has been tested for human consumption, and it is clear of any adulterates or other products that might be harmful for people.
Thank you so much for all your answers. I know that when I asked you to come on the podcast, we talked about 20 minutes, and it's been good 40 minutes always. We have such good conversations with you, and the questions have been amazing. And I'm just glad that we can count on you to educate us on all this all this stuff that people don't really realize. I mean, last year I hosted Lynn, who you work very closely with, who used to also be a Drug Policy Alliance alumni, and she really walked us through like legalization, and a lot of people had no idea that that was the process that it took. So before we go, leave us with what's next in terms of
Well,
drug policy in California and
very
over the United States.
great question. Thank you for asking that, because I think what's next is probably going to be one of the biggest reforms in the history of this country, even perhaps, not perhaps, certainly much more than even cannabis. Many have already know that in Oregon, we recently decriminalized the use and possession of small quantities of drugs. Now, this is very important, very, very important. There is a huge difference between what is decriminalization and what is legalization. And the
Mm-hmm.
simplest of interpretations of this is this: legalization has the full infrastructure of legal government and regulation for the sale and consumption of it. Decriminalization simply states that you are not going to go to jail for using, carrying, or even the minor sales of it, right? In Oregon, we recently passed a significant a significant groundbreaking reform that now takes these minor offenses out of the criminal justice system, and through their own funds of marijuana sales, tax dollars, they're going to actually fund and expand their medical infrastructure to provide assistance, direction, and support for people with problematic drug use. So what we're doing is we're removing this vital component that leads to such high numbers of incarceration and bringing it back into the public health arena. California, we hope to be next, and be able to decriminalize small quantities and start providing funding for public health, mental health, social services, So no longer throw somebody in jail for smoking a joint or doing some small quantity of drug, but instead provide them with assistance and help to hopefully get them the necessary resources they need to be able to advance. That we
Wow.
think is next. That is what we're working on from a drug policy perspective. And in the coming years, it's very likely you'll see a lot more conversation around this, the decriminalization of small quantities of drugs, and the repurposing and funding of more public health programs and harm reduction services.
Amazing. And that's music to my ears. And I don't know if I'm going to see this in my lifetime, but I really hope that a lot other drugs become also decriminalized and legalized. This to alleviate the black market that we see, all the violence, not just in the streets of in our communities, but also in all sorts of other regions in the country. I would love for us to adopt a more of a Netherlands, approach to, drug use and harm reduction too. They have really, in my opinion, have advanced. They just have a much more advanced way to look at this issue, and to understand
Well, many countries like Portugal is perhaps the Portugal has been the model for us, where they sought to expand public health resources and minimize the use of the criminal justice system as a tool. And right now, that is the model policy that we look to learn from and develop in some capacity here in the States. And Oregon, I think, was the first step towards that.
Incredible. Thank you so much for all your knowledge and for all the work that you do on this issue. Please keep us posted about your future campaigns so we can support you and we can bring more awareness to not just legalizing, but also decriminalizing drugs and harm reduction.
Thank you for having me again.
Yeah, of course. Good luck over there.
Thank you.
So that was Armando Gudiño with the Drug Policy Alliance. I hope that you found this conversation interesting and educational. And if you did, please feel free to share this with your friends, with your social media networks, because the conversation is always better and it always continues online. Have a great 420, you all, and I hope that you get to celebrate in whichever way you like. This is also Earth Week, or Earth Day Week, as I like to call it. And I have some very special programs in my social media that I'm going to be sharing. So please stay tuned, and we'll talk very soon. Have a great evening.